There are moments in life that divide everything into before and after. For CEO Richard Lawson, that moment came on a rainy Tuesday morning inside the glass skyscraper that carried his name. Outside, the storm rolled across the city skyline. Inside the boardroom, billion-dollar deals were being debated behind polished tables and expensive suits. But just beyond those executive doors, another life was quietly falling apart. Maria Alvarez, a soft-spoken cleaner who had worked in the building for 3 years without ever drawing attention, was hiding something beneath her uniform. Bruises. Bruises that told a story no one had ever stopped long enough to hear. Until Richard Lawson finally looked up and truly saw her. What happened after that would ripple through the entire company, changing not only policies but people. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and standing up for what's right, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Kindness Corner, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us continue telling stories that matter. Maria Alvarez was 26 years old and moved through the halls like someone trying not to exist. She was always early, always efficient, always silent. Most employees barely noticed her. Some thought she was shy. Others assumed she was cold. But the truth was far more painful. Behind her silence lived fear. Her nights were filled with shouting, slammed doors, and the sound of a man's anger crashing through thin apartment walls. Her boyfriend Caleb had once been charming. Now he had become someone cruel, unpredictable, and dangerous. But Maria didn't know how to leave. She had no family nearby, very few friends, and her cleaning job at Lawson Enterprises was the only stable thing left in her life. The cost of her silence was written across her body. A fading bruise near her cheekbone. Fingerprints hidden beneath long sleeves. Eyes that avoided mirrors. Richard Lawson, on the other hand, was impossible to ignore. At 38, he was one of the youngest self-made CEOs in the city, admired for his sharp instincts, relentless discipline, and powerful presence. But success had cost him more than anyone realized. He was divorced, distant from his teenage daughter, surrounded by people who only told him what he wanted to hear. Richard had spent years building an empire so large that he stopped noticing the people quietly holding it together. He didn't notice the cleaners. He didn't notice the assistants. He barely noticed anyone outside the executive floor. Until that morning. It started with a spilled cup of coffee in the executive lounge. Richard had returned early from a client meeting and walked in just as Maria was cleaning the mess left behind by a careless executive. The moment she saw him, she flinched. Her hand instinctively moved to cover her cheek. And for one brief second, their eyes locked. Not the kind of glance people forget. The kind that lingers. The kind that says something without words. Her eyes were red. Not from exhaustion. From pain. Richard noticed the faint purple mark near her face. Bruises didn't lie. Suddenly, a memory crashed into him. His daughter crying after her mother remarried. The way he had dismissed her sadness as just a phase. The guilt still lived inside him. And now, standing in front of Maria, it came rushing back all at once. He slowly stepped closer. Maria immediately stepped back. Richard raised his hands gently, trying not to frighten her. There were 100 questions in his mind. But instead of asking them, he did something completely out of character. He sat down. Maria froze. In 3 years, nobody in that building had ever spoken to her as though she mattered. But Richard calmly asked if she needed water, if she wanted to sit, if she was safe. Each time she quietly shook her head. But her trembling hands told the truth her voice could not. Then Richard softly said, "You don't have to pretend here." Something inside her broke. A single tear rolled down her cheek. And then she ran. Richard barely slept that night. The image of Maria's frightened eyes stayed with him long after the office lights went dark. The next morning, he pulled her personnel file himself. He learned her full name, her emergency contact, her salary, barely enough to survive in the city. Then, for the first time in years, Richard started asking questions no CEO in that building had ever asked before. Did the company offer domestic abuse support? Mental health resources? Emergency protection services? Nobody had answers. So Richard decided he would become the answer. Maria didn't come to work for 2 days. When she finally returned on the 3rd morning, she looked pale and exhausted. But something inside the building had changed. The receptionist greeted her warmly. A small care package waited inside her locker. And later that evening, when Maria entered the janitor's closet for supplies, she found Richard sitting quietly inside. This time he didn't ask questions. He simply handed her a small card. On it were the numbers for a women's shelter, a legal advisor, and a licensed therapist. "If you ever need someone to talk to," he said gently, "they're here for you." Maria stared down at the card, her fingers trembling. Then, barely above a whisper, she asked, "Why?" Richard was silent for a moment. When he finally answered, his voice cracked. "Because someone once told my daughter to stay quiet." He lowered his eyes. "And I've hated myself ever since for not listening sooner." That night Maria made a choice. Not to fix everything overnight, just to take the first step. She called the shelter. She spoke to a counselor. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel completely alone. Quietly, Richard paid for her therapy sessions. He approved her transfer to a safer daytime shift. And inside Lawson Enterprises, he began changing the company itself. Anonymous reporting systems were introduced. Mental health support became available for every employee. Upper management was required to complete empathy and workplace protection training. Slowly, whispers spread throughout the building. The CEO was changing. He no longer walked past janitors without acknowledging them. He stopped to speak with receptionists, interns, and cafeteria workers. And when a young employee reported harassment from her manager, it was Richard himself who escorted the man out of the building. People were stunned. The media called it a public relations stunt. But those closest to Richard noticed something different. Not in his words. In his eyes. In the way he finally listened. Meanwhile, Maria slowly began rebuilding her life. She filed for a restraining order, moved into a shared apartment with other survivors, and through company-sponsored classes, she earned her GED. One afternoon after class, she opened her locker and found a letter waiting inside. It was from Richard. The note simply read, "You are stronger than you know. And when you're ready, there's a desk waiting for you here. No pressure. Just believe." 3 months later, Maria walked into the HR department with confidence in her step and a quiet smile on her face. She wore a soft lavender blouse. For the first time, she no longer felt the need to hide her arms. Her eyes were brighter, her posture stronger. And from the balcony above, Richard watched silently, feeling something shift inside himself once again. Not pride, not relief, something softer, something closer to grace. If Maria's courage and Richard's transformation touched your heart,